Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're exploring this idea of regenerative justice in tourism. It's a concept that's been on my mind a lot lately, especially as we think about, the future of travel.
Yeah.
And to help us unpack all of this, we're turning to an academic research note. It's called Regenerative Justice and Tourism. How can tourism go beyond restoration? By Raymond Rastegar.
Interesting.
So we're going to dive into what this regenerative justice actually means, how it kind of goes a step beyond what a lot of folks are talking about these days, restorative justice, and why it matters, especially if you're interested in, where tourism is headed in the years to come.
Yeah, for sure.
Now, one of the things that really struck me in this research is how it kind of starts with a reality check. Tourism's often seen as this positive force.
Yeah.
It's supposed to help people connect and, learn about different cultures. But the reality is sometimes it can actually make existing inequalities even worse.
Right.
And Rastegar highlights this with some pretty eye-opening examples.
Oh, really?
Like, he points out that when it comes to those frequent flyers, the folks who are hopping on planes all the time, only 1% of the global population are those folks. But they're responsible for a full 50% of all those aviation emissions.
Wow.
And here's another crazy stat. 80% of the world has never even set foot on a plane. But a staggering 98% of deaths related to climate change are happening in the global south.
It really makes you think about, the whole idea of sustainable tourism, right? Are we just paying lip service to this concept, or are we truly willing to address the systems that are causing these imbalances?
Yeah, it feels like we're trying to fix a broken bone with a Band-Aid sometimes. And it's not just about emissions either. The research note also talks about the 2017 Caribbean hurricanes as a case in point. Those hurricanes were devastating. But the research suggests that the damage was made even worse because of vulnerabilities that already existed, things like poverty, the fact that a lot of people live in low-lying coastal areas.
Yeah.
And even the lingering effects of colonialism.
Right.
Makes you wonder if sustainable tourism is even possible when the playing field is so uneven.
And you see this happening, everywhere. Even with this surge in over-tourism that we're seeing in the post-pandemic world, think about places like, Barcelona or Amsterdam or Venice. They're all struggling with the negative impacts of, too much tourism. And the local communities are starting to, push back and say enough is enough.
Right.
It highlights the need for something, something different.
Definitely. So if sustainable tourism isn't enough, what's the alternative? The research actually points to restorative justice as a really important first step. But then it takes it a step further and introduces this idea of regenerative justice.
Okay, so maybe just to clarify for folks who aren't familiar.
Sure.
What exactly is restorative justice?
Well, it's really focused on acknowledging that harm has been done and making sure that the victims of that harm have a voice.
Okay.
It's about righting wrongs and trying to, make things right.
And are there examples of that, in the tourism industry? Or, related to some of the issues we've been talking about?
Well, actually, a good example that comes to mind is the Loss and Damage Fund that was agreed upon at COP27. This fund is specifically meant to help those vulnerable communities in the global south who are dealing with the worst effects of climate change. And it's kind of a way to, offer some form of reparation for all those historical injustices they faced.
That's great.
Yeah. But here's the thing. The research also points out that as vital as restorative justice is, it kind of hits a wall when we're talking about damage that can't be reversed.
I see.
Like the research uses the example of climate refugees from the Pacific Islands. If rising sea levels submerge their homelands, there's literally nowhere for them to return to.
Right.
So restoration just isn't possible in those cases.
That's a tough one.
Which brings us to regenerative justice. It seems to go beyond simply fixing what's broken. So what does that actually mean?
Well, regenerative justice is really about creating systems that can actually thrive and regenerate on their own. It's about moving away from this scarcity mindset where we're just trying to, limit the damage and embracing, a mindset of abundance and possibility.
So it's not about going back to some perfect past. It's about creating something new and hopefully better.
Yeah, exactly.
It almost feels like a more proactive and holistic approach to sustainability.
Yeah.
We're trying to, address the root causes instead of just putting Band-Aids on the symptoms.
You got it. And what I find really fascinating is that regenerative justice draws a lot of inspiration from indigenous worldviews.
Oh, interesting.
These cultures have always understood that everything is interconnected, and they've emphasized living in balance and harmony with nature.
That's really cool. So how does all of this actually work in practice? Like, what are the steps involved in, to putting these ideas into action?
So the research note actually outlines 4 key steps to this whole process: identify, engage, respond, and regenerate. And the first step is really about identifying the harms that have been done. And that includes not just the obvious stuff, but the more subtle things too. And it's not just about like the immediate impact. We also need to consider, the long-term effects on people, on the environment, even on future generations.
Yeah, thinking about that legacy we leave behind, right? Not just focusing on the quick wins or the immediate profits, but really thinking about those ripple effects that our actions today have down the line.
Exactly. And then the next step is to engage everyone involved. And I mean, everyone, those who've been harmed, those who are, maybe responsible, even the folks who are kind of caught in between. It's about creating a space for, open and honest dialogue where everyone can share their perspectives and we can start to acknowledge that, this is a shared responsibility.
So it's like moving away from that blame game and more towards a collaborative problem-solving approach.
Yeah.
Instead of pointing fingers, we're coming together to say, okay, how do we actually fix this?
And then comes responding to those harms that we've identified. And this could involve, all sorts of things: policy changes, community initiatives, even just shifts in individual behavior. But the key here is that it's not just about fixing the immediate problem. It's about addressing those underlying systems that led to the problem in the first place.
So getting to the root of the issue, not just treating the symptoms.
Yeah.
And creating that systemic change that prevents these harms from happening again, right?
Exactly. And then finally, we get to the regenerate step. And this is where things get really interesting, I think. Because it's not just about fixing what's broken. It's about, actively creating systems that can thrive and regenerate on their own over time.
Okay, now that's where I need you to, break it down for me. Can you give us some real-world examples of what this, regenerative justice actually looks like in tourism?
Absolutely. So the research note actually highlights this great example in New Zealand. It's called the Tiaki Promise. And it's more than just your typical Leave No Trace campaign. It actually encourages visitors to care for, well, everything: the people, the culture, the land, the sea, nature. And it's really rooted in this Maori worldview of being deeply connected to the natural world. And what's so cool is that it's like woven into the entire tourism experience, from the moment you apply for a visa to when you see those signs at the airport, even to the way accommodation providers and tour operators run their businesses.
It's so much more than just a slogan or a pamphlet.
Exactly. And you know what? They've actually seen a real shift in visitor behavior. Like, more people are actually engaging in those responsible tourism practices.
That's awesome. It's not just about, telling people what not to do. It's about, inspiring them to actively contribute to the well-being of the place they're visiting. That feels so much more effective.
Absolutely. And then another great example is Ecuador's 2008 constitution. They actually recognize the rights of nature in their constitution, which is pretty groundbreaking. So it's not just about, protecting nature for our benefit. It's acknowledging that nature has intrinsic value and deserves to be protected for its own sake.
Yeah.
And it's led to some really interesting legal cases where communities have sued to protect rivers and forests from pollution and exploitation.
That's incredible. So it seems like regenerative justice is really challenging our assumptions about, how we relate to nature. Instead of seeing ourselves as separate from nature, we're recognizing that we're a part of it and we have this responsibility to, protect it.
Exactly. It's about moving from a transactional approach to a more relational one, like recognizing that we're all part of this interconnected web of life. And our actions have, real consequences. But it's not just about individual responsibility. Rastegar also talks about the need for a decolonial and transdisciplinary research paradigm. And that's something that we need to really consider if we want to implement regenerative justice effectively.
Okay, now that sounds pretty academic.
Yeah.
What does that actually mean in the context of tourism?
Well, it's basically about breaking free from this Western-centric way of thinking and embracing a more holistic and inclusive approach to knowledge. So, for example, instead of just relying on, economic models to measure the success of tourism, we might want to incorporate indigenous knowledge systems that value things like ecological balance and community well-being.
Right. So it's about recognizing that there are many different ways of knowing and understanding the world. And we can learn from each other, especially from those who've been historically marginalized and whose voices haven't always been heard.
Exactly. It's about challenging power dynamics and creating space for diverse perspectives. Because, Western approaches to tourism, while often well-intentioned, can sometimes perpetuate those colonial patterns of exploitation.
That's a really important point. So, okay, we've got these high-level concepts, but how do we actually put them into practice? How do we take those, and turn them into tangible actions?
That's the million-dollar question, right? But those four steps that we talked about, identify, engage, respond, and regenerate, they give us a pretty solid framework, and they can be applied at different levels, from individual travelers all the way up to entire destinations.
So it's not just about, like, governments or big corporations making changes. It's about each of us taking responsibility.
Exactly. We can all contribute in our own ways. As travelers, we can choose destinations and businesses that are committed to sustainability and social responsibility. We can support local communities, engage in meaningful cultural exchange, and of course, minimize our environmental impact.
Right. So even those, like, seemingly small choices that we make as individuals can actually add up.
They really do.
But, okay, big question. Is regenerative justice actually achievable? Or is it just this, like, utopian ideal?
Well, Rastegar acknowledges that it's not going to be easy, especially in a world that's so driven by, short-term profits and individualistic values. But I do believe it's a goal worth striving for.
So how do we overcome those challenges? How do we shift from a system that, so often prioritizes profit over people and the planet to one that actually values, well-being and sustainability?
Well, I think it starts with changing the narrative. Like, we need to move beyond this idea that sustainability is a burden or a sacrifice. Instead, we should frame it as an opportunity for, innovation, creativity, growth.
So focusing on the positives, the potential benefits, right?
Exactly.
Not just what we had to give.
And we also need to recognize that sustainability and justice, they're not separate things. They're actually deeply interconnected. We can't have one without the other.
So it's about creating a win-win-win scenario for people, for the planet, and for the tourism industry itself. But, okay, how do we measure progress? Like, how do we know if we're actually moving in the right direction?
That's a great question. And I don't think there's, like, a simple answer. The metrics are going to vary depending on, the context and what we're trying to achieve. But what's clear is that we need to move beyond just counting trees planted or carbon emissions reduced.
Right, it's bigger than that.
It's about social equity, cultural vibrancy, community well-being.
It's about the whole picture.
Exactly. We need a more holistic approach to measuring progress, looking at a whole range of indicators, both quantitative and qualitative, to really assess the health and resilience of the whole system. And I think it's crucial that we involve, diverse stakeholders in this process, including local communities, indigenous groups, even future generations.
This has been, this has been such an insightful deep dive so far. We've explored this concept of regenerative justice, its roots in indigenous worldviews, and how it could really transform the tourism industry. But there's still so much more to unpack. We'll be back shortly to explore even more about regenerative justice and what it means for the future of travel. Welcome back, everyone. This deep dives into regenerative justice, well, it's really got me thinking differently about travel. It's not just about, minimizing harm anymore. It feels like it's about creating something better.
Yeah, it is hopeful, isn't it, to think about tourism as a force for positive change. Like, imagine travel that actually helps to heal and regenerate the places we visit instead of just taking from them.
And what I keep coming back to is this focus on justice, right?
Yeah.
It's not just about protecting the environment. It's about making sure everyone benefits from tourism, and that those who've been, historically marginalized, that their voices are heard and they have a say in shaping the future of tourism.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that sustainability and justice, they go hand in hand.
And it really makes you rethink your role as a traveler. It's like, we're not just tourists buying experiences, right? We're part of this complex system, and our choices really do have an impact.
Yeah. It's like shifting from what can I get to how can I contribute? Instead of just thinking about what a destination can offer me, thinking about how I can give back to that place and its people.
So it's about reciprocity, mutual benefit, and, like, really understanding that we're all connected. But how do we actually make this happen? Like, what are some concrete steps we can take to, put these ideas into practice?
Well, I think the first step is just educating ourselves, like learning about the principles of regenerative justice, the challenges different places are facing. There are tons of resources online, books, documentaries, even travel blogs that are all about responsible tourism.
Right. So the more we know, the better choices we can make. What else?
Well, we can be intentional about where we spend our money, right? We can choose to support those businesses that are actually walking the walk, like businesses that pay their employees fairly, that source their products locally, and that give back to the community. You can even look for certifications like B Corp or Fair Trade. Those usually indicate a commitment to social and environmental responsibility.
So it's about aligning our actions with our values, right?
Right.
Using our money to support businesses that are doing things the right way.
Right. It's sending a message that we care about more than just getting the cheapest deal.
And beyond, where we spend our money, we can also just be more mindful of how we behave while traveling, respecting local customs and traditions, really trying to connect with the people we meet.
Yeah, being a good guest, basically.
Yeah.
Someone who wants to learn and understand, not just, check things off a list.
Exactly. And of course, minimizing our environmental impact, choosing eco-friendly transportation, reducing our waste, all that good stuff.
Right. Those things all add up.
But I keep coming back to this idea that regenerative justice can't just be about individual actions, right? We need systemic change.
That's true. It's about the whole industry changing its approach. We need to move away from mass tourism and embrace a more holistic, more regenerative way of doing things.
So we're talking collaboration, innovation, challenging the status quo, working together to create a whole new model for tourism.
And that's where that decolonial and transdisciplinary research comes in. We need to bring in all these different ways of knowing, including indigenous knowledge, to find solutions that are both effective and fair.
It's about recognizing that there's not just one right answer, right? We need to be open to different perspectives and approaches.
Absolutely. It's a challenge, but I think it's possible, and the stakes are high. If we want tourism to be a force for good, we need to embrace this idea of regenerative justice.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. I hope everyone listening feels inspired to think differently about travel. Before we go, I want to leave you with one last thought. Imagine a world where tourism doesn't just avoid harm, but actively contributes to healing and regeneration. What would that look like? What would be possible if we shifted from a mindset of taking to a mindset of giving back? Keep asking those questions, keep exploring, keep pushing for a better future for travel. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.